Shalom Aleichem. We are learning Likutei Sicha, Chelek Shoftim, Sicha number 2, about the mitzvahs that are born on the rabbinic mitzvahs. And this is based on a pasuk in today's parsha, which says that we have the mitzvah to listen to the sages. According to the teachings that they teach you, and the mitzvahs that they tell you, shall you do. Lo yisasar Mikol advarim, do not stray from any of the things that the sages tell you. And this is in today's parsha, obviously a big deal, fundamental mitzvah. That we have to listen to the sages, and that is the source of the concept of mitzvahs that are bonon. In general, listening to their laws, all the takonis chachamim, the rabbinic enactments and protections and safeguards to the Torah, etc. But also specifically, the Sicha is not just about that, but the mitzvahs, 7 actual new mitzvahs. So the Rebbe brings the Rambam. This is the Rambam's introduction. And the Rambam says this is the introduction to Mishnah Torah. After he lists all the 613 mitzvahs, he lists them one by one. And the Rambam finishes. These 613 mitzvahs were given at Sinai. 248 positive, 365 negative. And then there are other mitzvahs that were instituted after Sinai and established by prophets and sages such as Megillah, Chanukah candles, Tisha B'Av, Eiduvin, Netilas Yadayim, etc. We're obligated to accept and observe all of these newly instituted mitzvahs as stated. Don't stray from the words of the sages, unquote. Beautiful. Says the Rebbe, this is the question of the Sicha. Why doesn't Rambam state a number for rabbinic mitzvahs? Why doesn't Rambam state a number for rabbinic mitzvahs? Let him say that there are 7, as brought in many svarim. The Shalom says it, and the Ramah brings it in one of his svarim, and etc. In classic svarim, it said that there are 7 mitzvahs that are born on 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. Rambam was the master of numbers, who numbers everything. Why doesn't he bring that number? And the Rebbe goes through the trouble of explaining to us how Rambam is the master of numbers. Rambam says he leaves no number out, except for this one. There are 14 books to this book that I wrote. And then he writes this in his introduction as he goes through the books. And then he repeats it when he comes to each actual sefer of the 14 books. What does he write? That, for example, that this sefer, let's call it the first sefer, Sefer Hamada. It has X amount of halachas, laws. Then it has X amount, and then each one he writes how many mitzvahs. So, for example, the first set of halachas, the laws of Yesodis HaTorah, the fundamentals of Torah. So Rambam will give an opening that there's 10 mitzvahs, 6 positive, 4 negative. And at the end of the whole book of Sefer Hamada, he will recap it, that there's 75 mitzvahs. I'm reading 16 positive, 59 negative. He does this by the end, I guess the beginning and end of the end of every book. He sums up the mitzvahs and then divides it up. And he also sums up how many different type of halachas were in that book. He also, at the beginning of every set of halachas, not just every book of the 14 books, of every set of the 83 halachas, which Rambam makes a point to tell us that there's 83. He will say that in this set of halachas, there's X amount of mitzvahs, and so many are positive and negative. He's counting mitzvahs all over the place. And this whole exercise is also done at the introduction when he goes through all the mitzvahs and how they correlate to the various of his 14 books. He tells you how many mitzvahs in each section. He tells you how many sections, how many chapters. There's 14 books, there's 83 halachas, different type of laws. There's X amount of chapters in each one of those, he says, as he comes to them. I mean, he's giving us numbers, and the commentaries on the Rambam and the Rebbe himself explain that this is the Rambam's way of being organized and also keeping it that we should be able to remember it. And yet, there's one mitzvah omitted, one number omitted, one rabbinic mitzvahs. Why? He just lists a few and he says, etc. Why doesn't he give you a list and give you a number? This is a great question. So the Rebbe suggests two explanations, but these two explanations the Rebbe doesn't like, and then the Rebbe comes to the explanation that the Rebbe presents. Explanation one, you know why he doesn't give a number? Because they're innumerable. Because if you think about all the rabbinic enactments, there's no end. Take Shabbos. But then there's all the shvusim, all the rabbinic enactments that you shouldn't do, like muktzah. And that itself has so many details. Take the kosher laws. So much of it has overlays and overlays of rabbinics. All the things that we don't eat because of rabbinic law, not just meat and milk, but chicken and milk. And things that are cooked and baked by a non-Jew. I mean, it goes on forever. The laws of mikvah. There's the basic law of the Torah, and then the Chachamim overlaid all kind of stringencies and additional halachas. Forget about the laws of prayer. Biblical, it's very narrow. Say the Shema and ask for your needs when you need it, or what have you. And there's a whole book of the whole much about prayers and brachas, and much of it is rabbinic. So how many rabbinic enactments are there? Innumerable. Thousands. Really, it's brought down in Svarim that there's no end, there's no number of halachas, because halachas keep evolving based on new applications. But even if there were the halachas that made it into Rambam's book, if he wanted to give it a number, it would be thousands. He's not numbering something like that. He's numbering things that are finite. There's X amount, there's 613 mitzvahs. That's a big number too, but it's a number. He's not going to list. And if you're a student of Rambam, my anecdotal information would be that for every halacha in the Rambam that's biblical, there's at least 10 rabbinic. And those who know more than me would probably say that that number is not just 10 to 1, but 100 to 1. I mean, it's full. So therefore, Rambam doesn't get involved in the business of counting rabbinic things because there's no end. That's the Rebbe's suggested proposal explanation number 1. But the Rebbe rejects it because the Rebbe says, my question is not that he should have listed how many rabbinic laws there are. I'm talking about rabbinic mitzvahs. Yeah, rabbinic laws is there's any number, thousands. Rabbinic mitzvahs is only 7, as we find in many sources. Classics give a number. What's the difference between a rabbinic mitzvah and a rabbinic law? A rabbinic law means an enactment that is an overlay over an existing biblical mitzvah. For example, you have Shabbos, and the sages came and they added muktzah, and they added different shvusim. Don't do this just in case you'll come to do that biblical violation. So these are all the laws that I just spoke about that are overlays to existing Torah laws. But the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs are not referred to as laws. They're mitzvahs. They're completely new. They're not related, if you will, and they're not add-ons or overlays to biblical mitzvahs. They're new. The sages came up with new stuff. Chanukah, Purim, Netilas Yadayim, light your Shabbos licht. Make a bracha before you eat, not just after you eat. So that's all we're asking, says the Rebbe. List the 7 mitzvahs as brought in the classics. Incidentally, what are the 7 mitzvahs that are generally known? So we say Chanukah and Purim and washing the hands, Chanukah licht. Washing the hands, Shabbos licht. And then you have Erev. And then you have Hallow. And then you have brachas before brachas. Brachas is a general term for all the blessings before you eat, blessing before you smell something. The only blessing that's biblical is going to be birchas hamazon, the grace after meals. Okay. So this is our question, and it's a very, very strong question. If you know how the Rebbe thinks and how Rambam wrote his book so organized, this wasn't an oversight. This is not an oversight. I must tell you that this is the first time I'm learning this Sicha. Thanks to Project Look at the Sichas, I'm learning many Sichas for the first time. And but this is a question that bothered me. It didn't bother me enough to look for an answer, but it bothered me really every year when I learned Rambam. I finished the Hakdama of the Rambam, the introduction, and he starts listening all the mitzvahs. It takes like 4 days to get through that whole section. And suddenly, and they all get so much attention and organization. And suddenly he says, and by the way, there's rabbinic mitzvahs. And he says, as an example, for instance, this, that, and the other. It's very strange. It always struck me as very strange. It doesn't fit with the Rambam's style of nailing everything down. It's like it's a stepchild, and it's clearly not. Because in Rambam's book, all of these 7 mitzvahs are discussed in detail and all their laws. It's not overlooked, but it's only overlooked in terms of not giving it a number. And he makes the point that there's no number. The Rabbi doesn't say this in the Sicha, but I think it's implied. Rambam doesn't give a number. He doesn't even list 7. He lists 5 examples, and he says, etc. He's making the point. I'm not telling you how many. You'll figure it out. You'll learn my whole book. You'll figure it out. Why? Why doesn't he do this? It's very, very troubling. There has to be a point to it. Let's put it that way. So here's the Rebbe's question right on top of the screen. We try to propose explanation number 1, that it's too innumerable, and we rejected that because it's not the case. We're only referring to the 7 mitzvahs. So the Rebbe gives explanation number 2. This is where it gets a little bit interesting in terms of lumdis, in terms of mind twisting, brain exercise. And that is that perhaps Rambam's approach is that all rabbinic mitzvahs add up to 1. There's really only 1. What is that mitzvah? Quote, follow the rulings of the sages and don't stray from their words. The words from today's parsha. And therefore it's only 1 mitzvah. The Torah just gave 1 command. Listen to the Chachamim. Hear their words, respect their mitzvahs, and then becomes only 1 mitzvah. And the Rebbe analyzes how this could be, and it's based on achreinim, on later day commentaries, who explain that Rambam, some of the achreinim have the opinion that Rambam holds that these are all 1 mitzvah, all rabbinic. Now, how can you say they're 1 mitzvah? Let's assume the Torah says, listen to the sages, don't go astray. But then the sages tell you 7, so now they became 7 instructions. So they want to say no. Perhaps the mitzvah is not to do this and not do that, which would make them many mitzvahs, but rather the mitzvah is to listen and obey the words of the sages. And the Rebbe elaborates on this a little bit, that it's not, and brings from those commentaries. The mitzvah isn't even the act of doing or not doing. The mitzvah is more the hearing and accepting the truth of their mitzvahs. And therefore it's 1 mitzvah. It's 1 mitzvah. Whatever they're going to say. What did they say? They said 7. But whatever they say, we have a mitzvah to accept. And these achreinim, these commentaries that say this, they base it on the language of the Rambam. And the Rambam says, lishmoya, to listen to them, which indicates like nasa v'nishma, to accept. And that's the mitzvah. That's the mitzvah of follow the sages' ruling, don't stray from their words. Accept it. Accept it. And that is a very general thing. It's 1 thing, acceptance of everything, all the mitzvahs that they're going to say. It's not to do the details of what they're going to say, which would then constitute many mitzvahs. So that is the Rebbe's proposed answer. Perhaps, again, it's based on other commentaries who see the Rambam in that way, that the rabbinic mitzvahs are only 1 mitzvah. And a good example that the Rebbe gives, 2 examples. 2 examples. It's a mitzvah in the Torah to listen to doctor's orders. It's based on a verse in Nishmartim L'nafshi Seichem that you should guard your soul, take care of your health. So it becomes almost a mitzvah. It becomes like a mitzvah to listen to the doctor, take care of your health. But are we going to say that there's many mitzvahs? The doctor says you should take care of this part of your health, you should do this for your health, that for your health, take this pill, take that vitamin. So you're going to have 17 different mitzvahs? No, there's 1 principle. The Torah didn't say that you should take vitamin A and vitamin B. The Torah said you should listen to the doctor. The details, the doctor will tell you, and they don't all become mitzvahs. So that would be the similar thing here. The rabbinic mitzvahs, the command is to listen to them. The details, they'll tell you. They don't all become mitzvahs. Another example the Rebbe gives is, there's a Torah mitzvah of honoring your parents. Now, how do you honor them? What do you mean you honor them? Are you going to bow down to them? You don't honor them in the abstract. There's details. You don't sit in their chair, you help them out, you give them food, you give them drink, you take them in, you bring them out, you don't contradict their words, etc. Let's assume there are 10 different laws of how do you have to honor them. Does that become 10 mitzvahs? That it's a commandment not to sit in your father's chair, and it's a commandment not to contradict your mother? No. There's one mitzvah, honor your parents. And the rest are details, because honoring includes all these details. So similarly, these commentaries want to say that the mitzvah is to sort of honor the sages, accept that their words are true, whatever they're going to tell you. And then what do they say? They said 7 mitzvahs. They also said some other things, many, many other things. But in the context of this discussion, they said 7 mitzvahs, so you do it. But it doesn't become 7 instructions, because it's not an instruction to do this or do that. It's an instruction to follow, to honor, to accept, to believe in their words. And that is a very abstract and essential, it's one point. So that is the Rebbe's proposal. And this will be based, again, on many numerous achreinim, a few of the achreinim, the later day commentaries, who believe that that's the Rambam's approach. And the Rebbe says supports that explanation, because those commentaries who say that this is Rambam's approach, why do they say it? What forces their hand? What forces their hand is, you see, an argument between Rambam and Ramban, Maimonides and Nachmanides. Rambam famously says that that rabbinic mitzvahs are like biblical, as he writes in the introduction, because the Torah says, the person, Rambam says also in the laws of Mamonim, of rebellion, that if a person doesn't listen to the sages, he's violating the biblical mitzvah of lo yisasar, of not going astray from their words. So Rambam is very big on the fact, and he emphasizes it in the introduction and other places, that listening to the sages and listening to their mitzvahs is a biblical thing, based on the verses of today's parsha. Ramban says, really? If so, how come biblical mitzvahs are stricter than rabbinic? They should have the same validity, same level, and yet they don't. For example, famous example, if I'm in doubt about something, if it's acceptable or not acceptable, etc., when it comes to a biblical observance, I have to go stringent because it's biblical. If I'm not sure, I have to do it. If it's a rabbinic law and I'm not sure whether or not I did it or I have to do it, over there I can take the lenient approach. The example that comes to mind is if I'm not sure whether I said the benching, I have to do the benching again because it's biblical. I can't take a chance. If I'm not sure if I said the bracha rishona, the blessing before the eating, safek brachas lahakal. If I'm not sure, I'm lenient. Why am I lenient? Because it's rabbinic. I mean, there's hundreds of examples. And therefore, it's clear in Jewish law that rabbinic mitzvahs, are less stringent in their application than biblical. And Ramban says to Rambam, why should they be? You argue that they're biblical, based on the verse of lo yisasar, that you have to listen to the sages. So these commentaries are trying to help answer that question. And they say, as we just said, that since rabbinic mitzvahs aren't specific obligations, but they're general obligation to obey the sages. So then, let's take the specific mitzvah, lighting Chanukah licht. That's not a mitzvah. The mitzvah is to believe and accept that all the mitzvahs that the sages will give us are true. They're binding. And of course, you'll act on it, because that's going to trickle down to that. But it's a general obligation to obey and accept with faith, so to speak, this truth. It's more of a mitzvah of attitude than a mitzvah of action. And therefore, you cannot put it anywhere on the level of the biblical. The biblical, every mitzvah stands alone. This is a command. This is a binding behavior. Whereas the rabbinic mitzvahs, these sages would argue, these commentaries would argue, there is no specific binding obligation to light Chanukah licht and then to wash Netilas Yadayim. The only real binding obligation is to accept all the mitzvahs that the sages will give us. And therefore, how could you put these details on the same level of a biblical mitzvah? Of course you can't. That's how they answer Ramban's objection. And the Rebbe now wants to apply that to his question. And therefore, there's no point in Rambam giving it a number. He's not giving it a number to bring home this very point, even though I said earlier he will deal with all of them in his book, in his work, Mishnah Torah, and in detail and all their laws and all their derivatives. In fact, throughout the book, he lists them again in each in their place when they come up. But he omits their number in the introduction just to make this point, that you should know the mitzvah observance of all rabbinic mitzvahs is one, to obey. So far it seems like a very good approach. The Rebbe takes it further. The Rebbe says that there are some who hold that the difference between biblical and rabbinic mitzvahs is so great. Right? We said now one of the differences might be, according to these commentaries, these later day commentaries, that that there aren't even specific obligations for the 7. It's just one obligation to obey. But the Rebbe is saying it even further, that there are commentaries that hold that rabbinic mitzvahs are gavra and not chefza. Translation, there are obligations on the yid, on the person, but not that the mitzvah object in and of itself is that important. Where would they get this from? They get it from the negative rabbinic prohibitions, you see. It's known, and this is the opinion of almost everybody, that the rabbinic prohibitions differ from biblical prohibitions, that biblical prohibitions, the behavior or the object is treif. Rabbinic prohibitions, you're not allowed to do it, but it itself is not treif. The example would be milk and meat, or chicken and meat. Milk and meat is biblical, chicken and meat is rabbinic. I can't eat, God forbid, milk and meat, because this is a piece of treifus. It's like chazer. It's death for a yid, right? It's klipa, it's terrible. I'm looking at, whereas a chicken and chicken milk and chicken and milk, which is rabbinic and it's only a protection on the law, it's not that chicken and milk is treif. But the sages said to you as a Jew, you don't do it. Don't do it. It's a protection. But in and of itself is not treif, and that makes it chefza versus gavra. Gavra versus chefza, rather. It makes it an obligation on the yid, a prohibition on the person. The sages prohibited this behavior because they want to protect you. They want you to be more careful. But not that the behavior itself is inherently bad. The differences will be certainly al pi Chassidus. If I did it by accident, how bad do I have to feel? Is there in fact klipa inside of me, unholiness, or no? Etc. In the language of Tanya would be, if inadvertently I ate meat and milk, or if I ate chicken and milk, could I use that energy to serve Hashem and elevate that energy? So according to this logic, if it's a biblical prohibition, I can't elevate it. I can have all the right intentions. Just like if I eat a piece of chazer, that energy can never be elevated unless you have the higher level tshuva and you completely transform it. That's another conversation. But nominally, I didn't know, I did it by accident, doesn't matter. It's treif. It is bad. Whereas rabbinic, I ate chicken and milk, God forbid, nothing, there isn't klipa inside of me, and arguably I could elevate those sparks. And this is the approach of almost all of the halachists, that rabbinic prohibitions are only prohibitions on the people, but not that the object, the behavior, etc., is inherently bad. Just parenthetically, the Rebbe brings in the footnote that this we have to discuss how this jives with the Alter Rebbe, who in Tanya actually does seem to elevate rabbinic mitzvahs to the level where they are inherently bad, and exactly in the aforementioned conversation that perhaps if you ate a treif thing rabbinically, you cannot elevate it. But that's in a footnote, and the Rebbe doesn't deal with it. The Rebbe says, Tzarech and Gadol, we have to figure out how this jives with the opinion of almost all the halachas that this is actually the case. So therefore, in the case of rabbinic prohibitions, it's clear, taken by almost everybody, that it's merely prohibited on the person and not about the object. Says the Rebbe that there are those who are going to want to say that the same is in the flip side, in rabbinic to-dos, in rabbinic obligations, that they too are not really about the object of the behavior but rather about the person. So let's take an example. The sages said you should light Chanukah licht. According to this way of thinking, it's not that Chanukah licht are psahilika thing. There's holiness, there's kedusha there. The Chanukah licht must be lit. No, the sages want you to be inspired. They want you to remember Hashem and the miracles. So they said you should do this. But what you're doing is not such a holy act. Let's call it, you're doing a regular act which will affect you in a good way. It will inspire you. It's almost like a symbolic mitzvah. It's not an actual mitzvah. It's good for you to do this, but not that it must be done. So this is how commentaries want to say, this is how they answer the Ramban's question on the Rambam. Again, why biblical mitzvahs are stricter than rabbinic? How could you compare them? The Rebbe is making sort of two very scholarly points here. Number one is that rabbinic, I'm recapping this little section because it's a little challenging. Number one is rabbinic mitzvahs, there aren't really specific obligations according to this thinking. It's really a general obligation to obey. Number two, even more so, that it's not really about the mitzvah, it's about the person's behavior that the sages are after, because they want you to be inspired. But what they're telling you to do is it doesn't take on the status of a mitzvah behavior, of a mitzvah. It's a behavior that's good for you in order to keep you inspired. If this doesn't sound like the Rebbe, it's not, because the Rebbe rejects this completely. And the Rebbe says, Rambam, let's start with 2. Rambam clearly is emphatic that rabbinic mitzvahs are real and binding individually. And none of this stuff, the Rambam says it right here, it's a mitzvah to hearken to them, lishmoya, belishmer, to observe. It's not just a mitzvah to accept the validity of their mitzvahs, but to actually do it and follow it. And then in Hilchos Mamanim, which is towards the end of his work, in the laws of rebellious behavior, the Rambam gives a whole introduction. The rabbinic laws and rabbinic mitzvahs, the Bezdin HaGadol, the Supreme Bezdin, Supreme Court. This is Iker Teresh Ba'Peh. This is the foundation of the oral Torah. And from that great Bezdin comes out all the rulings. And one who, I'm quoting, this is from Hilchos Mamrim, the Rebbe points to it in the footnote, the laws of a rebellious person, and one who doesn't follow their rulings violates a biblical prohibition. Also here in the introduction, when Rambam introduces the 7 mitzvahs, again, without giving a number, he says, he uses the word mitzvahs, plural, many times, that there are many mitzvahs that were innovated after Har Sinai. And these mitzvahs have different reasons and different laws. And every one of those numerous mitzvahs, the yesh l'chol mitzvah, every one of these mitzvahs has overlays and laws and customs and takonis and enactments. So you see, Rambam is clearly holding that there's mitzvahs, there's many, it's not just one. I mean, he rejects this outright. And does not see them as just good suggestions for you to live a good behavior. You know, this might say like civil laws like that, like don't pass the red light. Don't tell anybody I said this. There's nothing wrong with passing a red light, except that it's not practical. So if it's 2 o'clock in the morning and there's nobody around, would you pass the red light? I'm not going to tell you if I would, because this is on record. But if you would, you're probably not such a bad person. unless there's a camera that's going to give you a ticket. There's nothing wrong with passing a red light. There's something wrong with the behavior. It's not like if you pass the red light, you have to do tshuva. You did something that's immoral, that's unholy, that defiles your soul, that affects the cosmos. No. If you pass a red light, there can be an accident, which is a terrible thing, and therefore you should not do it. It's an instruction, it's a behavioral instruction. And that's why when there's no behavior involved, if you're sitting 2 o'clock in the morning and there's nobody around and you're sitting by a light, you're probably an idiot. Don't tell anybody I said that. Whereas if I'm eating something that's chatz v'shalom not kosher, there's never an exception. I mean, obviously, in case of life and death, etc., that's a different story. But there's no such thing that it's a small amount and it doesn't matter and there's nobody here. What's the difference? This is not about you being a good person. So, well, I ate it, I didn't know. So it doesn't make you a bad person behaviorally, but what you did is bad. And the Rebbe says that clearly the Rambam holds that same truth is in rabbinic law too. Now, what you did is bad. It's not passing a red light. It's eating a shtickl chazer when I eat a rabbinic treif, according to Rambam. Again, Ramban, as we saw before, thinks differently, but Rambam is very strong, and the Rebbe is obviously a big fan of Rambam, and Rambam holds that they are biblical. So this explanation number 2 doesn't work, but the Rebbe actually gives 3 reasons why they don't work. I focused on number 2. Number 1 is, why would Rambam deviate from his custom of numbering just to make this point? So Rambam agrees that there are 7, right? It says it in many classic places. But he doesn't number it just to teach you the concept that it's really just one general mitzvah. You know what I mean? The Rambam doesn't omit any other numbers. He makes sure to tell you that there's 83 chapters and how many chapters in each section. I mean, the numbers go out. It's not just about the mitzvahs, it's about the chapters and about the halachas. So this number is just going to omit just to make this point. Plus, if he wanted to make this point, this is a very important point. He should have said it clearly, either here or in Hilchas Mamadim, when he discusses in detail our respect for the sages and their enactments. This is not a point that you make by omission. So the Rebbe says that doesn't make any sense. And finally, this is very interesting. Point 3, why we're not saying that Rambam is of the opinion, like those Achronim, like those later day sages, that hold that the mitzvahs, that rabbinic mitzvahs, are not really specific mitzvahs. It's just a general thing to listen to the sages. Here's how we know that Rambam doesn't hold that. Another way. Rambam goes through the pains in the introduction, right here, the section that we're studying. After he says that there are also rabbinic mitzvahs that were innovated after Sinai, and he gives the example, for instances. Rambam says you should know that these don't constitute adding to the Torah, which is prohibited. And why not? And he gives a whole explanation. Because the sages who added it, they didn't believe that now instead of 613 mitzvahs, there are 620. That would be terrible. You can't add to the Torah. They didn't say that, the Torah says, the sage comes, I have news. Hashem just changed his mind, said you have to do Natilas Yadayim. No. They said that we, the sages, the power vested in us, we're saying you should do it because of whatever their reason is that they make an enactment. And therefore, it's not constituted adding to the Torah. So the Rambam goes through the trouble to clarify why rabbinic mitzvahs do not constitute additions to the mitzvahs of the Torah, which would be a problem. Says the Rebbe, why does Rambam have to go through that trouble? If the Rambam is in fact of the opinion, as these Achronim, these latter-day sages would hold, that there aren't really 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. There aren't really mitzvahs. It's just a mitzvah to listen to whatever they come up with. If that's the case, of course they're not adding to the Torah. There's only one mitzvah in the Torah. Listen to that. So why would you even have to go through the trouble to explain how it's not an addition? But the Rambam does go through that trouble, because clearly Rambam holds that there are actual mitzvahs. It's not one generality. There are rabbinic mitzvahs. Do this and do that and do this and do that. So now the question still stands very, very strong. Why doesn't Rambam give a number like he does by everything else? So the Rebbe gives his answer, an explanation. Like always, it's out of the box. The Rebbe says, the answer really lies in the language of Rambam himself. Rabbinic mitzvahs are by definition innumerable, because they're all about the sage's authority to innovate. What's the language of the Rambam? After he lists all the 613 mitzvahs, he says, yes, mitzvahs acheris and itzchachu. There are other mitzvahs that were innovated by the sages, which they did over time as needed, as they felt it's required, or what have you, to protect the Torah or to inspire Jews to honor God, etc. By definition, the authority was given to the sages. To what? To innovate, to do something new. How could you give a number? It so happens they only gave us 7 mitzvahs. But the spirit of it is, you go innovate. And in laws, they innovated thousands. But even in mitzvahs, they innovated 7. So what? But the concept here is innovation. As by contrast to Torah mitzvahs, which could never be changed. In fact, the Rambam does say that in his Hakdama, his introduction as well. That all the mitzvahs in the Torah, they are binding forever and ever, and they could never be added to. He says it right in this section. They could never be added to or never be subtracted from. The definition of a biblical mitzvah is established. This is it. It will never change. It's going to be this number, and never in history, even after the Mashiach comes, will there be a 614th mitzvah. Because Torah says don't add. Hashem doesn't change his mind. Hashem's will is him. Hashem don't change, his will don't change. There will never be a 614th mitzvah. That's a fact. You can take it to the bank. However, when it comes to the sages' mitzvahs, Rambam says just as emphatically, these are mitzvahs, go ahead, innovate. How could you give a number? Their definition is that they're up to you. You pick a number. And the Rebbe goes through explaining this in detail. And by the way, because they can also add as needed. That's part of the language of Rambam. They add it as needed. So how do you know what the need will be tomorrow? And the Rebbe says, even though, so that's the Rebbe's answer to this question. The Rebbe deals with a few issues here. The seeming objections to this answer. Practically, none can be added because there's no Bezdin Hagadol. We don't have the Supreme Bezdin. And therefore, theoretically, we can't add any more mitzvahs. And if there's 7 rabbinic mitzvahs, as many classics say, that's how it's going to stay. So why doesn't he give a number? So the Rebbe says that's because, first of all, when Mashiach comes, the Bezdin will convene. It will be possible. Second of all, even now, it's practically impossible, but conceptually it remains open-ended. The concept is, Hashem says to the sages, innovate at will, as needed, as per your wisdom and the power vested in you by Torah. The fact is that we don't have the Bezdin Hagadol, so we don't have the Supreme Bezdin, and the authority is no longer there, so it can't be done for practical reasons. It doesn't take away the conceptual concept that it's all about their innovation. And the Rebbe gives an example to explain where something can be practically one way, but conceptually it still remains another way. And he brings it in the Rambam's work itself. The Rambam gives a ruling, gives an introduction to Sefer HaMitzvahs, that which mitzvahs did he count? The Rambam wasn't the only one to count mitzvahs. There were others, most famously the Bahag, who came before. And they don't have the exact same count, the same total, yes. But Bahag will count certain mitzvahs and Rambam will count some others, and there's disagreement. So the Rambam's introduction of Sefer HaMitzvahs gives principles of how he decided to count the mitzvahs. And one of those principles, I believe it's principle of 3, Rambam says, I only counted mitzvahs that are forever. They're not timely. They're not temporary. So, for example, the Torah gave the Jews a mitzvah in the desert not to leave the manna over till the morning. It's a mitzvah from Hashem. Or in preparation for Har Sinai, don't come close to the mountain. Or when they were moving the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the Levites shouldn't walk in before they cover, the holy objects, because they shouldn't see the holy objects. These are all important obligations, but they were only temporary, and therefore, because they don't apply in the future temples, or they don't apply, there's no manna in the future, and therefore, none of these mitzvahs will be counted as a 613, and Rambam is counting. Rambam only counts mitzvahs hanoegis l'deidis, mitzvahs that are always binding, even though some might temporarily be halted, like we don't bring sacrifices today and all those mitzvahs. It's still binding. The minute Mashiach comes, we will. So Rambam gives an example there of a mitzvah that you can question, that practically is no more, and yet he lists it. Not like sacrifices that practically is just interrupted, but we'll come back the second we can do with Mashiach. No, there's an example of a mitzvah that's practically gone. It will never again be able to be done. Namely, the mitzvah of destroying the 7 nations of Canaan. How do we know why they're practically gone? Because the nations are gone. It's done. And yet Rambam lists it in Sefer HaMitzvahs. Why are you listing it? How is it different than the mitzvah not to leave over the manna, which is not relevant because we'll never have manna again? So the mitzvah to wipe out the 7 nations, it's not relevant because they're wiped out. So why does Rambam count it? So the Rebbe explains, as the Rambam explains in that introduction of Sefer HaMitzvahs, principle 3, Rambam explains it in great detail. That Hashem gave a command, and the command is timeless. It's forever. You got to do the mitzvah of wiping out the 7 nations. Practically, the mitzvah is already accomplished. Okay. It still remains an eternal mitzvah. Another example would be that there's a mitzvah not to marry in the nations of Ammon and Moab. That mitzvah is not practical because those nations are already intermingled with all other nations and they don't exist as a standalone. So the mitzvah is not applicable. And yet Rambam puts it in. Because again, there's a practical reason why it's not doable. But theoretically, conceptually, it still exists, etc. And therefore, this is now, the Rebbe is applying this thinking to this idea that rabbinic mitzvahs don't have a number. And why don't they have a number? Because they're immeasurable. The Torah gave the power to the sages to innovate. The fact is that now there's no bezdin. It's a practical problem. And when Mashiach comes, it's going to be, arguably there will be. The Rebbe even wants to push the envelope and say that it's possible that even nowadays an authoritative court can open up in Eretz Yisrael and everyone can agree on their authority and they might be qualified for it. Now, practically, there are only 7 rabbinic mitzvahs, and it sounds like it will not change even when Mashiach comes. And that's why we find in many sources that there's hints to this. We brought earlier, the Shalah says it, and the Ramah in one of his Svarim. It's hinted in the fact that the word Keser, which is Hashem's crown, equals 620, because Hashem's crown represents his will, right? Kabbalah and Chassidus, Keser, the crown is the will. And what's Hashem's will? Keser, Gematria, Taf Reish Chaf. The crown is numerically 620, because 613 mitzvahs and 7 rabbinic. And this is brought in Svarim. Also, even the Balaturim brings down that there's 620 letters in the 10 Commandments, because they allude to 613 mitzvahs. And the last 7 letters, which the word Asher L'Reyecha, to your friend, they allude to the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. So the fact is that there will only be 7. Let's assume maybe even after Mashiach comes. So the Rebbe says it doesn't matter. Hashem put in these hints because Hashem knew that's how it's going to be. But why is it only 7? Because that's what we did. That's what the sages did. The authority was handed over to the sages. And based on that, it could have been hundreds, could have been 10, it could have been 50. It doesn't matter. And therefore Rambam will not give a number. Again, the fact that Hashem knew and therefore hinted it in these two ways, that there's only going to be 7 mitzvahs, that's all well and good, but that's not what pushed the hands of the sages. And the Rebbe borrows a concept from Rambam with the well-known conundrum of Yediyah and Bechira, Hashem's knowledge versus our free choice. Judaism believes it, and it's fundamental in our belief that we have free choice when it comes to moral things. So let's assume tomorrow I'm going to have a choice of doing God forbid, a sin or not doing it. I have total choice, because if not, there's no concept of Yiddishkeit. But does Hashem know whether or not I'll do it tomorrow? Of course he does. So how do I still have choice? So the Rambam explains, says the Rebbe, that Hashem knows because Hashem is beyond time. Let's assume to Hashem, tomorrow already happened. But the fact that he knows is not what forces you. You do what you want to do. You do it or don't do it because of your own choice. Sometimes the example is given, let's assume the weatherman knows what the weather is going to be tomorrow. Is he the one that's causing the weather to be like that tomorrow? No. He just happens to know what's tomorrow because they have tools. Usually they're wrong, of course. They have tools that, based on those tools, tomorrow already happened. Because they look what happened elsewhere and it's the same weather pattern that's coming through, whatever. And similarly, knowing the future doesn't mean that that's what's creating the future. Similarly here, the sages and Torah tells us that there's only going to be 600, there's only going to be 7 mitzvahs. But that's not what forced it. And Rambam, therefore, is not going to write the number 7 because it's not a thing. He wants you to know there's no number to the mitzvahs. Practically, there's only 7. So what? Conceptually, it's absolutely not limited to 7. Incidentally, I just omitted a little point that this idea that possibly even nowadays an authoritative court may be qualified to make new laws. And the Rabbi gives an example that just like all the laws of the Talmud till the closing of the Talmud are binding on all Jews. After the closing of the Talmud, not so much because the Jews scattered, Ashkenazim, Sephardim, and there never was a unified rabbinic authority. But until the closing of the Talmud, all the laws are binding for all Jews. But the Bezdin HaGadol, the Supreme Bezdin, was closed down many, many years prior to that. And yet it's still binding because there was a unified authority. And therefore, it's possible that even nowadays should be this concept. Anyway, so this is how the Rebbe answers the question. And the question is satisfactory. Put to bed, Rambam does not give a number of mitzvahs that are rabbinic because they actually don't have a number, even though practically they do. So here's where it gets interesting. Up Chassidus, the Rebbe finishes this Sicha and teaches us a fantastic thing. So what are we saying? Rabbinic mitzvahs have no number, but you know how many there are? 7. This is such a Jewish thing. There's no number, but it's 7. Like, why did that happen? There's no accidents. What's the point? So the Rebbe explains that al pi Chassidus, al pi Kabbalah, you see, rabbinic mitzvahs can be included in the term the crown of Hashem. Just like the sages say that when a person learns halacha, halacha is called the crown of Hashem. Specifically halacha. As opposed to, let's say, I'm learning Chumash, I'm learning Navi, I'm learning even, I'm learning Torah Shebiksav. That's beautiful. That's referred to more as Hashem's wisdom. Hashem's book, he wrote that book himself. When it comes to learning halacha, we call it, this is Hashem's crown. Crown, we know from Kabbalah, is Ratzin, it's the will. What's the crown that hovers over your head? What's the crown that's greater than your understanding, your limited self? Your Ratzin. If I want something, I want it even if it's not reasonable. Because it's important to me. So it's like a crown, it's over my head. I do it even if it doesn't have a real rationale. And therefore, this is a general concept that's discussed a lot in Chassidus. That therefore halacha, which is the discussion of Hashem's specific will of how you should act, even though it's counterintuitive. That should be lower than Torah Shebiksab, than the written Torah. Written Torah written by God himself. This is discussions of the sages, and they're hashing it out, what the law should be here, there, and innovating on those laws and putting enactments and fences on those laws. And yet that is considered Hashem's crown. The answer is yes. And the explanation is that the explanation is that Torah Shebiksav, the written Torah, is what Hashem gave us. Ultimately, anything that comes from Hashem is going to be infinite. However, you can't give infinity. You can't reveal infinity. And therefore, it's finite. It's 5 books of the Torah, it's 24 books of the Tanakh, what have you. There's 613 mitzvahs. It's finite. What does that mean? It's coming from Hashem. It should be infinite. The answer is, Hashem can't give us infinity. You can't reveal infinity in reality. And therefore, Hashem gave us, he brought the Torah down, so to speak, into Chachma. It's called Chachmas Hashem. Chachma means a system. And therefore it's limited, so to speak. Of course, it contains infinite wisdom, but the reality is, what can Hashem reveal to the world? It's only limited, and therefore Torah is Hashem revealing himself. And what is revealable? Finitude, Chachma, that which is reasonably transmittable. And therefore, it's going to be limited. It's going to be finite. But then Hashem said to the sages, when you take my Torah and you develop it and you reveal it, you're going to discover its essential infinity, and therefore oral Torah is really infinite. There's no end to how many laws there will be and can be, because the laws can be applied in any which way. The example that Rabbi brings in a footnote, that, that it says, Eishes Chayla Teres Bala, that the wife reveals the crown of the husband. The concept of creation, which is Yesh Me'ayin, which is infinite power, creating infinite number of generations, etc., is brought about not by the husband, but by the wife. But wait a minute, isn't it his power? Yeah, but he can't reveal it. You can't reveal infinity. But somehow, because his Eishes Chayil comes and reveals his potential even deeper than he can give. And this is the concept, similarly, that the sages, if the written Torah is referred to as Musar Avicha, the teaching of your father, and the oral Torah is referred to as Torah Semecha, the teaching of your mother. Just like the father and the mother, the written Torah is the concepts, the essence, but they're limited. And the oral Torah is developing and creating the miracle of birth, if you will. Because the makabel, the recipient, is actually the one that reveals the essence of the giver more than the giver can reveal, because you can't reveal essence. Essence is the opposite of revelation. But you can uncover it through the inspiration of the recipient, and that is similar to the model of the oral Torah versus the written Torah. And this is a short and not such great explanation of why halacha and Torah Sheba'al Peh, oral Torah, is referred to as Tago de Malka, the crown of Hashem, because it's the Ratzon Hashem. Therefore, we're very careful with halacha. We understand that therein lies, in a way, a greater holiness, a greater God than in the Torah that he himself wrote. Says the Rebbe, if that's true with all rabbinic law, it's even more so true in the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. This concept that it's the crown of the king is celebrated because it's rabbinic. It's Torah Sheba'al Peh. It's the oral Torah. It's what we, the Jewish people, the Jewish sages, uncovered in Hashem's Torah, touching his essence as explained. Which is more, just the details of the laws of Shabbos, or 7 entirely new mitzvahs that they sort of figured out Hashem really wants? This is oral Torah on steroids. This is halacha on steroids. So if halacha is Hashem's crown, the Rebbe is stretching it and saying, and maybe innovating here, that similarly the 7 mitzvahs are certainly Hashem's crown. Says the Rebbe, look at a crown. A crown is over the head, but it has to fit the head. Everything in Chassidus and Kabbalah matches the concepts to the practicality. And it even says with the kingdom of the house of David, how did you know who's the next king? If the crown fit him. So the crown represents over the head. in the analogy that we're giving, it's infinity. The head is Chachma. It's the first of the 10 Sephiros, the first of the 10 finite revelations of, so to speak, of Hashem. But the crown is above the head. It's the will. The will has no limit. But yet that limitlessness does manifest itself in some limit. I want to give a plain example. A person has a limited capacity. Let's assume physical strength. How much can I lift up? I can lift up 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 50 pounds. Sometimes, when it's a case of danger, God forbid a child is pinned under a car, people find themselves picking up a car. We're fitting through very narrow spaces. Things can be done that are really impossible at other times, and you look back, you say, how did I do that? And you can't reenact it. So it's explained in Chassidus because in those moments, you're revealing the crown, you're revealing the Ratzin, you're revealing the soul's willpower. And the principle is nothing gets in the way of willpower. And why not? Because willpower is not reasonable, it's not rational. I have my thought process, I have my emotions, I have my physical strength, my finite structure, my gestalt, it's limited. Suddenly my soul needs to do this. The child's pinned under the car. I did it. How? I have no clue. So it's a representation of infinity, even though it's not totally infinite. You know, I can pick up a car, but I'm not sure I can pick up a truck or a house. Like, why not? If you're telling me it's infinite. And the answer is, it represents infinity, but because it's the crown, but it's the crown that fits the head. It represents infinity, but it's manifest in finite expressions because we're living in a world of the finite. So that would be the Rebbe's takeaway, that Rambam is teaching us. Rabbinic mitzvahs, he doesn't give a number, even though there is a number. I'm not going to give you a number because the spirit of rabbinic mitzvahs, here they have an edge on Torah mitzvahs. This is infinity. When you're doing a rabbinic mitzvah and really all of their laws, you're touching a lukus greater than the biblical mitzvahs. It's infinity. There's no number. As explained earlier, that it's revealed through the Yidden and the Chachamim and the whole thing. The fools who criticize the way Torah was given, that the sages really have to really write the whole book. They don't understand the concept. It's like in marriage. Hashem is married to the Jewish people, and we create the babies. We create the miracle of what? Of revealing Hashem's essence in infinite forms of halacha. And therefore, when I'm doing a small halacha of the sages, I'm protecting myself from muktzah. Or certainly in the 7 mitzvahs, I'm lighting a Shabbos lichtala. This is a greater infinity. If you're a chassid, then you understand what the Rebbe is saying. And yet, it expresses itself in finitude, because that infinity was given to us in our world. How many? 7 mitzvahs. And I think the Rebbe is trying to allude that the 7 mitzvahs, because there's 7 spheres, there's 7 dimensions of creation. Yes, there is a system. Our world does live in a dimension of 7. We can't live in a world of Kesser, of infinity. It's not going to be applicable. So it's 7 spheres. But those 7 spheres contain infinity. Friends, what's the takeaway of the Sicha? What's the lesson? The Rebbe is teaching us how to look at Torah Sheba'al Peh, how to look at rabbinic mitzvahs, and in general, how to look at halacha. That they have this combination of infinity in the finite. On the one hand, they're infinite, as explained. There are an infinite number of halachas. And really, there isn't a number to how many mitzvahs there are. And why so? Because they represent Hashem's crown, as we said. Hashem's infinite wisdom and will. On the other hand, there is a finite number of the mitzvahs. Because that infinity manifests in our world. And in our world, everything is finite. Not only it's finite, as we said earlier, it manifests in 7 mitzvahs, which is the definitions, the dimensions of creation. 7 days of the week, 7 days of creation, 7 midos of Hashem. So that combination represents the combination of the finite and the infinite. Hashem's bligvul infinite manifesting in our world. What's the takeaway? That whenever I'm following halacha, in the 7 mitzvahs, or really in any halacha, and I feel that I'm getting down into the details, I'm getting bogged down by details, they feel like very finite. This is the time for the mitzvah, and this is the way you do the mitzvah, this is the temperature for the kashrus, this is how much matzah you have to eat. I mean, all these things that represent total finitude. And one says that this doesn't feel like it's divine, doesn't feel holy and transcendent and infinite. It feels very finite and limited and squashed. Says Torah, this is Ratzon Hashem. This is the will of Hashem. The crown of Hashem, which is infinite. It's not 7 or 10 spheres even. It's Keser. It's infinity. There's infinite. However, Hashem magically put it into the finitude of the minutia of the halacha. Halacha carries infinity, but halacha is very much about finitude. It's very much about technicality. Who would ever think that the legal part of Torah is a representation of the greatest infinity? If I told you Kabbalah and Chassidus is infinity, it makes sense. No, we say the crown of Torah is halacha, legalese. Legalese is technical. And the answer is yes, because it represents bringing into our space and our reality the infinity. How do you bring infinity into our reality? If it's Hashem's will, it's by definition infinite. Every mitzvah has infinite value, infinite power, infinite potency, infinite impact. But where? On my life, on my world. And therefore, it's going to manifest in my life, and it's going to be finite. It's going to be at a certain time, in a certain place, a certain temperature, a certain dimension, a certain quantity, etc., etc. And that's true also in Torah study, when you're learning halacha. Interesting, as Chassidim, the Rabbi has us learning halacha every single day. And as the Rabbi finishes the Sicha, quoting that whoever learns halacha every day is guaranteed to share in the world to come. Why? Because the world to come represents that we see the true infinity, the true essence of Hashem. What's the magic of halacha? When you're learning Torah, you're learning halacha, you're learning Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah and all of its analysis. Every one of those svaros, every one of those ideas. Take, for example, some of the svaros and the things that we learned in this Sicha. Is it Gavra? Is it on the person? Is it on the object? All of these ideas, the wisdom, the depth in it is infinite. I'm someone who learns Torah and Sichos with people who are very educated, lahavdil, in secular knowledge, doctors and lawyers and accountants and surgeons and professors, what have you. And yet when it comes to learn a Sicha, they break in a sweat because the wisdom is deep. Ultimately, the wisdom is infinite. That's why Torah is so brilliant and so exciting and so rejuvenating and brings so much joy. And you can apply one idea in Torah to an infinite number of applications. However, every idea of Torah is studied through a practical minutia application. The idea is studied in what case? It's a case of an ox goring a cow. It's a case of milchiks and fleishiks. You don't give it in the abstract. Torah doesn't speak about the idea of the minutia, of the abstract idea. It speaks about those brilliant, infinite even ideas in the manifestation of the garment of details. So when I'm doing a technical mitzvah, or learning halacha, or learning a Rambam, or learning Gemara, or Sicha, and trying to understand the back and forth, don't think this is small. This is infinity expressing and reflecting itself in the finite. Sometimes Chassidus says that if you want to know how Hashem relates to us and to our mitzvahs, and that every little tiny halacha that we follow, or every word of Torah, is really a nuclear explosion on high, think of the fact that the entire sun is reflected on a glass of water. Or as the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, that when the shade of the sun moves a few feet down here, it's because it moved thousands or millions of miles on high, reflecting the idea that our little actions that are tiny. I said Krishma on time instead of doing it not on time. And it reflects something that is beyond imagination. Because really, Hashem's will and halacha is infinite. But Hashem, with his kindness and his love, gives it to us in our world of the finite. And perhaps not unlike the fact that these concepts of halacha, of Hashem's crown, of Hashem's infinity, the truest infinity is not top down. It didn't come, so to speak, from him, from Torah Shebiksav and the written Torah, but it's something that we bring to the table. Again, bringing home the concept that, in a sense, the fact that the highest infinity can manifest in the lowest spaces is reflected also in the people that do that, namely human beings, Yidden, tzaddikim, but humans. And therefore, suddenly there's a whole new geschmack in halacha and in the details of the laws, including and especially the laws of the sages, rabbinic enactments, and even more especially the 7 rabbinic mitzvahs. They have no number. You can't count them. They're infinite. but they're really 7.